All right. Hi, everyone. Can you all relatively hear me? Yes. All right. I see you nodding, so that's good. My name is Chelsea Mitchell. For I think some of you know me. For those of you who don't, watching at home, I am the Deputy Director of the Historical Society. I'm going to be doing introductions this evening. So I wanted first to introduce Elizabeth Kading. She obtained a degree in history and English literature from UConn. She's worked at Mystic Seaport, the University of Connecticut, and currently at Clean Ocean Technology Systems. Her professional experience spans historical research and interpretation to technical editing and proofreading. So she and Nancy, who will also be presenting this evening, have been working together for a number of years on the life of Venture Smith. Nancy Steenburg, who's also presenting this evening, is an adjunct professor in history and director of the Bachelor of General Studies program at the University of Connecticut at Avery Point. She's a graduate of Radcliffe College, at Harvard University, Trinity College, University of Connecticut, and is the author of numerous publications. So please join me in welcoming our speakers this evening.
132 participants.
Thank you all for being a part.
Yeah, so we don't talk.
The presentation isn't on just Venture Smith. It's on the lives of Blacks and Native Americans who've made Stonington their home over the past 400 years. You're probably aware of February's Black History. And you're going to have a chance to learn about Black history right here in Stonington. Liz Kading and I have been on this path of discovery for more than 15 years, starting in 2005, as we sought evidence on the life of Bro Tier Furo, also known as Venture Smith, perhaps the most notable person of color who ever lived in Stonington. A narrative of the life and adventures of Venture, dictated by Venture in 1798, was the starting point of our discoveries. But the introduction, written in 1798, contained a subtle warning about the degrading negatives of slavery. I'll read it for the people on Zoom. I'm not sure it's large enough for them. The reader is here presented with an account of an untutored African slave. And if he shall derive no other advantage from perusing this narrative, he may experience those feelings of shame and indignation that will prove him not to be wholly destitute of every noble and generous feeling. The reader may here see a Franklin and a Washington in a state of slavery. He still exhibits striking traces of native ingenuity and good sense. This narrative exhibits a pattern of honesty, prudence, and industry to people of his own color. And perhaps some white people would not find themselves degraded by imitating such an example. Even in 1798, some people recognized the horrors of slavery and discrimination. Liz and I discovered early on that Venture's story in Stonington was the story of a hidden population in town. People who contributed to the building of the town, its economy, its prosperity, and to its success in surviving over the years. The story was also one of slave owners who exploited and abused their human property and prospered. A major problem was that the concrete evidence to reveal that hidden population was itself often hidden from easy access, and that white records of slave ownership often obscured the evidence. From 2019 to the spring of 2020, Liz and I worked as a team to document Venture's life in Stonington and the Black and minority community in Stonington for the upcoming permanent exhibit on Venture Smith that will be installed this year the Stonington Lighthouse Museum. Now, apparently there was some concern that research on slavery in Stonington might uncover some negative aspects of that early community. One person literally questioned whether or not the research would have to reveal the bad parts of slavery. Well, there are no good parts of slavery, no matter where you find it. Right, whether it was a conscious effort or not, in the past, those who've written of Stonington's history often ignored the minority population, both Black and Native American. In the vault at the Stonington Town Hall, Liz located a small book written on the history of Wickety-Quack that asserted that the town was founded solely by stout Anglo-Saxons. That early history claimed that the name Wicklywalk came from a Saxon word that meant a feeding place for wild ducks. The author gave no credit or recognition to the original inhabitants of the area, nor did it recognize the value of the unpaid labor of hundreds of Africans and Native Americans who did much of the onerous labor of creating a community. As we did our research, we also discovered that some of the documents, including birth and death records, land records, appeared to have been, I'll use the word sanitized or scrubbed, of records of African and African American slaves and free people of color in town. And one set of documents that might have provided an accurate picture of property ownership by minorities or slave ownership by whites, the tax records of the town no longer existed for the years prior to 1790. And despite census evidence that there were Blacks in town in 1790, the tax records for the years 1790 to 1799 did not list a single Black or Native American landowner. Nevertheless, by persistence, we teased out the details of a surprisingly large minority population in the 18th century and its interaction with the dominant white community. And an aside, they one year taxed dogs, $10 a year, but there was no record of taxing slaves, yet there were 73 slaves in the 1790 census. What was a research project to support the upcoming exhibit has become something more for Liz and me. A Witness Stones project for Stonington, an attempt to honor the humanity and contributions of enslaved peoples and recognize all those in the minority community who were a vital part of early Stonington. We have a long way to go, but tonight we'll discuss much of the evidence we've uncovered and perhaps give a voice to that forgotten and neglected minority. For context, let's look at slavery in colonial America. Many of you probably know the standard story of slavery in the Southern United States, both before and after the American Revolution. The mainstream concept was that slavery was rampant and abhorrent in the South, but a minor aberration in the North. What some people don't realize is that there were large numbers, relatively speaking, of enslaved Africans and African Americans who lived in the northern colonies and states from the 1740s to the 1790s, when abolition began in the North. Now, Native Americans were also enslaved, especially after the war against the Pequots and the Narragansett tribes. Lorenzo Green wrote a book, The Negro in Colonial America, in colonial New England in 1942. He made it clear that slavery was widespread in all of the northern colonies, but he pointed to Connecticut as one of the colonies with the most slaves, despite its relatively small size. Green asserted that owning slaves was not particularly common in New England in the 17th century, but that it expanded rapidly in the 18th century, in part because colonists looking for markets for their agricultural produce became enmeshed in trade with the West Indies. Not only did colonial farmers provide food, fiber, and even horses for use on slave plantations, many also became slave owners themselves. In Stonington, there might have been another reason, a more direct reason for the introduction of Black slavery. Shortly after the founding of the community, one of the four founding families, the Stanton family, established a direct trading connection with the West Indies. Daniel Stanton, one of the sons of the original Thomas Stanton, one of the town's founders, moved to Barbados in his 20s, that's in the 1660s. And he lived there until his death in 1687, where he seems to have functioned as a factor or a business connection for trade with Stonington. Throughout the early 1700s, residents in Stonington traded regularly with the West Indies. In 1760, Oliver Smith, we'll talk about Oliver a lot later, shortly before he built his house in Stonington, was involved with the ship Dispatch, including a cargo to the West Indies and a return cargo to Stonington that included India rum, New England rum, molasses, cider, 4 barrels of sugar, barreled beef, etc., etc. It was a short voyage. It lasted 17 days under Captain Jonathan Dennison. And Smith spent a total of 101 pounds, actually quite a bit of money for 1760. Right up until the American Revolution, town residents invested in trading voyages to the West Indies, consigning agricultural produce for trade on the plantations. Stonington net resident Nathaniel Miner in the early 1770s organized 3 different trading voyages by the ship Rebecca. And the consignment list for those voyages are here in the Historical Society, listing the Stonington residents who consigned horses, cheese, dried beef to go to the West Indies to sell to support the plantations. Now, there are over 250 people on this Zoom call. I'm not sure all of you have known Venture's story. I'm going to do a brief synopsis of Venture's story. My apologies to those of you who've read the narrative. Venture was born Brotier Furo in about 1729, the son of Sangam Furo, a prince of the tribe in Dukandara, Guinea. He arrived in Stonington in 1754 when he was around age 25, but not from the West Indies, not directly from Africa, but from Fisher's Island, where he'd been a slave in the household of the Mumfords. He'd been enslaved in West Africa at around age 6, purchased by a member of the Mumford family who renamed him Venture and brought him to Rhode Island. As a child, Venture worked at household tasks, but eventually the Mumfords put him to work on one of their farms on Fisher's Island. At 22, Venture married Meg, a fellow slave. Shortly after their marriage, a fellow servant inveigled him into an escape attempt with an escape attempt, 1754. George Mumford advertised that with an ad in the newspaper. It describes Venture clearly. I'm going to read a little bit. Venture, first his clothes, then it says, he is a very tall fellow, 6'2", thick square shoulders, large boned, marked in the face with a knife in his own country. Jumping forward, when they did archaeological excavation on Venture's grave in East Haddam, the space of compacted earth under the coffin showed he was at least 6'3" or 6'4". We have a description of Venture, 1754. Shortly after the escape attempt, Venture was sold to Thomas Stanton II, a young man in Stonington who had recently married and had inherited a house and farm from his late father. A house and farm in what's now Barn Island. 18 months later, Stanton bought Venture's wife, Meg, and their toddler daughter, Hannah. Venture and his wife had 2 more children, Solomon and Cuff, and the family worked as slaves for the Stantons until about 1760. After a violent confrontation between Venture and his owner, Stanton sold Venture to Hempstead Miner, and Hempstead Miner sold him to Oliver Smith in about 1761. Now, Smith, I mentioned before, he was a Groton native who had recently married into the Dennison family of Stonington and located his new house on the developing Stonington Point. Now, all of the founders' names are important parts of Venture's story and the story of the minority community. Now, where we're going to look. Connecticut state and town legal records and documents are a valuable but somewhat sketchy source for verification of the more public events in the lives of colonial era Blacks and Native Americans. Church and census records provided additional detail, and even something as minor as a petition in bankruptcy filled out the record. Such documents traced the involvement of Africans and Native Americans with getting married or joining a church, with buying and selling land, with incurring debts or lending money, and bringing lawsuits. Wills and inventories of estates reveal even more about Stonington's minority population and the white people who called themselves their owners. Even some cemeteries provided limited evidence. But clearly, the story of Stonington's minorities needed more examination. In his narrative, however, that Venture dictated in the 1790s, when he was in his late 60s, he rarely mentioned an African community in Stonington. So it's hard to interpolate from his recollections what slavery and minority status was for the majority of people of color in the 1700s. Nevertheless, Teasing out the evidence from the variety of records makes it clear that an unexpectedly large minority community was a vital part of town. But that research also made it clear that for most of those who owned slaves, those slaves were little more than assets to be exploited, not human beings with thoughts and feelings.
Okay. First, we're going to examine some of the hard numbers. Prior to 1700, the names of Black residents rarely appeared in any of the records. What appears to have been an informal census in 1668, just 19 years after William Chesbrough had been the first white resident of the town, that listed only 44 heads of household in the town, so 44 in 1668, with an estimated population of 220. Looking at genealogies of the founding 5 families, we found that the founders were prolific. In the 3rd generation, the Chesbrough, Minor, Palmer, Stanton, and Dennison families had over 200 grandchildren, though of course not all were born in Stonington, not all of them stayed in Stonington. The Road Church, Stonington's first organized religious society, not officially founded until 1674, admitted just 94 people to full membership in its first quarter century, including many members of the Chesbrough, Dennison, Palmer, Stanton, and Minor families. Another 61 town residents owned the covenant and subjected themselves to the discipline of the church. Not one individual in those 2 church membership lists was identified as Black or Indian. Nevertheless, despite the relatively low numbers of church members, in that same 26 years, the church baptized over 400 children and adults, but only 3 persons of color were recorded in the church records. Joseph, who's identified as a Blackamoor servant to Mr. James Willett. He was baptized on December 14, 1684. Chimham, an Indian brought up by Mr. Noyes in 1692, and Joanna, an Indian maid brought up by Captain Dennison in 1696. You need to remember that the word servant was the term 17th century Connecticut residents used when referring to slaves. And this was both Black and Native American. So it's not clear if Chimham and Joanna were free or enslaved when they were baptized. Yet these numbers make it clear that Stonington was producing enough homegrown labor that it did not need to use chattel slavery to make progress in establishing the community. More hard numbers were apparent in a colony-wide census in 1756 that revealed that Stonington had a population of 3,518 and had the 2nd highest number of Africans of any town in New London County. 200 men, women, and children, second only to Norwich, which listed 223. However, those census numbers might be suspect because New London, at that point, the 2nd largest town in the county, listed no Negroes or Indians in its count. And 18 years later, it listed 522 Blacks and Native Americans. So there's something fishy there. Nevertheless, it was notable that Norwich was nearly twice as large as Stonington, with 5,540 people to Stonington's 3,518. Perhaps equally as notable was that in that census, Stonington had the 3rd highest number of Africans of any town in the colony. If one adds the number of Indians listed in the census, 365, the highest in the entire colony, with the number of Africans, Stonington's minority population was 16% of the total. In 1761, Stonington held a town-wide census that assessed the population at 3,900. Not much of an increase in 5 years, but that census gave a clearer picture of the town's Black population, which had grown by 54 individuals. And you can see there, Black males 140, Black females 114. Notably, the census did not have a breakdown of the number of minors in each cohort. And for Blacks, the men outnumbered the women, a looming problem for family formation in the minority community. Nevertheless, in this homegrown census, minorities still accounted for 16% of the town's population. And also notably, Venture and his wife Meg and his 3 children would have been part of this total. On January 1st, 1774, as part of a colony-wide census prepared at the request of England's Board of Trade, just before the outbreak of the American Revolution, numbers revealed that the minority population of Stonington had declined as a percent of the total, but was still quite high. The total increase recorded in the town's population was astounding and therefore questionable. Stonington had supposedly grown from a community of 3,900 in 1761 to one of 5,412 in just 13 years, an increase of 1,512 persons, up 39%. Stonington seemed to be exploding at the seams. In the total population of 5,412 residents, the total of Blacks and Native Americans declined from 563 to 456, but still comprised over 9% of the total. 16 years later, the Black population of Stonington appeared to be on the decline. The first official US Census in 1790 identified 6 Black families with a Black head of household comprising a total of 23 Blacks in Black households. That same census revealed that 48 whites owned a total of 73 slaves. George Dennison, John Williams, John Randall, and Thomas Stanton each owned 4. Another 6 men each owned 3 slaves. And the rest of the enslaved persons were in households that owned 1 or 2 persons. That same census listed 20 free Blacks living in white households, perhaps Black children who were technically free persons under the Gradual Abolition Act of 1784, but were still under the age required for full freedom. The total of Black persons was 113.
So who and where were the minority residents? And historical research were logical. The place to start looking for the minority community in Stonington would be the town hall, where there are multiple ancient handwritten volumes of birth, death, and marriage records. In the earliest volumes, the evidence of minorities in town is sparse, to say the least, despite those census notations. Just 16 Black or Native American people had their births, deaths, or marriages recorded in official town records between 1654 and 1775. Literally, Cuff, a Negro servant owned by William Chesbrough. Also, Ando, Tim, and Sherry, owned by William Chesbrough. 1736 noted the birth of Plato, a mulatto. 38, Dinah, a mulatto. 1740, Catherine, a mulatto. The above servants are noted in the records as born in the house of Deacon Thomas Minor. It's a tiny number. Venture's 2 sons, Solomon and Cuff, would have been born in Stonington after 1754, but there is no record of Solomon and Cuff in the official records. Thomas Stanton II's children are all listed with their dates of birth in those records. But that's it. In the records from the 1650s to the 1770s, showing thousands of births of children of white Stonington families, marking hundreds of deaths and marriages, the lack of notice, the lack of entries for births and deaths of Blacks and Native Americans makes clear their position in white Stonington. On the margins at best, property at worst. So why did Black births start showing up in the town records in 1784 and after? It was an economic motivation. I tell my students, this gradual abolition law in Connecticut was because Connecticut residents were cheap. They did not want to just abolish slavery and lose their investment. The gradual abolition law directed that children born to an enslaved mother, March 1st or later, 1784, were born free, though they actually had to wait until age 25 to become free. And they lived in a state of virtual slavery until reaching age 25. The law provided no compensation for freeing such children, so slave owners became much more careful about recording the existence and date of birth of their slaves. Between May of 1784 and May of 1801, 24 Black children appeared in the town official land birth and death records. Sorry, birth and death records, not land records. 14 still clearly under the control of white masters because they were listed by their date of birth and the master, even though they officially were not enslaved, right? 10 were apparently the children of free mothers. Of the children still held by whites, only 3 actually included information on their mother's names. So in an aside, if you are a genealogist who is Black, who is trying to trace a family, how do you trace your family without surnames? Primus and Bristow and Elizabeth, sons and daughter of Chloe, are the only ones identified. Chloe does not have a last name, but the record says Chloe was the slave of Captain Ephraim Williams. We did find a list of 7 children born to free persons, Plato and Dinah. 7 children between 1790 and 1801. The parents had no surname, but the list included Sealer, Lucinda, Betty, and Sophie, along with their brothers George, Samuel, and Plato. Now, sadly for those children, we couldn't find any other verifiable record of their existence, and yet they did exist. They did live in Stonington. One additional vital statistics was also in the town records, a record of putting children into apprenticeships. For white children, this was usually an action that took place between the child's father and the person to whom the child was to be apprenticed. Indenture was contractual on-the-job training for many colonial children. Those documents were usually quite detailed on how the child was to be treated, on what skills the child would learn, and what the child would receive at the end of the term of apprenticeship. Typically, a suit of clothes, a Bible, a cow or a sheep, sometimes a small sum of money. Venture himself in his narrative indicated he apprenticed his older son Solomon at age 17 to Charles Church of Rhode Island for 1 year on the consideration of Church giving his son 12 pounds and an opportunity to acquire some learning. Now, the 12 indenture documents we found in the town records made it clear the town treated children of color in a very different way. In none of the indentures for children of color was the name of a parent mentioned, nor did the child appear to have any choice in the person who would control his or her life for years to come. White indentures literally said, John Stanton agrees to the indenture, or Mary Dennison agrees to the indenture. But Black children had no such choice. Now, in part, this might have been that these were poor children, because colony law allowed town selectmen to bind out poor children to save the town the cost of supporting them. But in the case only of Mary and Peter Derrick, described in their document as poor Indian mulatto children, was the word poor actually mentioned. Those taking on apprentices were, of course, from the town's leading families, the same families who had owned slaves: William, Stanton, Smith, Dennison, Randall. In only one case, relatively early on, 1769, that of 11-year-old David Derrick and 5-year-old Sue Derrick, both identified as mustee, which was their term, the colonial term, for a child born of Native American and Black parentage, did the indenture include the phrase, to be taught to read English and to write. Actually, for little Sue, her indenture said, teach her to read English if she be capable. Now, of the indentures we found, the majority of them were Native American and mulatto. No Black children who identified explicitly as Black were listed in indentures. Balked by the paucity of information and vital statistics, digging out the specific individuals who comprised the minority population required Liz and me to examine hundreds of other documents. Free Africans, slaves, Indians were visible in the church and local court records. Blacks and Indians, free and enslaved, showed up in justice of the peace records, often for what we call for public mischief.
After 1700, Blacks and Indians appeared more often in the records of the Road Church in Stonington, at least for a few years, registering births, baptisms, marriages, and a few admissions to full communion in the church. Racial identity was clearly an important characteristic, even in the Puritan religion, and this was the first source we examined in detail. As we mentioned, there were few records of Blacks or Native Americans in the church's 17th century records. Early in the 1700s, the number was still small. Tamar, an adult Indian woman, owned the covenant and was baptized in 1719. And in 1724, Dinah and Mary Martin, 2 Indian women, owned the covenant, submitted to the discipline of the church, and were baptized. In 1728, Hannibal, a mulatto young man, subjected himself to the discipline of the church. All three of these individuals appeared to have been free people. Compared to the hundreds of baptisms and admissions, girl, I'll crouch down, of whites in the period from 1700 to 1735, this was a minuscule number. The Great Awakening, a time of religious ferment and revival between 1736 and 1744, dramatically increased the number of people of color in the church records. Lorenzo Green asserted that it's difficult to know if Blacks and Indians were actively seeking religious membership during the Great Awakening or if their owners were imposing it upon them, but the numbers rose dramatically. For example, in just 6 years between 1736 and 1742, Road Church members witnessed the baptism of 76 Blacks and Indians at the church. What is notable is that their masters or owners were prominent men of Stonington. These were landowners, deacons, militia officers. Also notable is that all of the Black people presented for baptism in this period were servants, except for one important exception, a Black man named Primus. In addition, nearly all the individuals identified as Indian were also identified as servants. Even more notable was the almost complete lack of Blacks or Indians admitted to full membership in the church. Only a few actually owned the covenant to become members in good standing. In this period of religious ferment, 8 Native Americans not identified as servants became members of the church between 1741 and 1742, but not one Black person. Though there were few records of the marriages of Blacks or Native Americans in the Stonington birth and deaths recorded at the town hall for the 1700s, during the Great Awakening and shortly after, the church records revealed 9 marriages, some of which were marriages between free persons of color. I'll just name a few of them. In 1742, Peter, a Negro servant of Stephen Richardson, was married to Mary Jones, an Indian Negro mulatto, and apparently she was a free woman. Again in 1742, Joseph Garrett and Catherine, Indians, were married. In 1744, Prince, Negro servant of Elihu Chesbro, and Phoebe, a mulatto, freeborn, were married. And in 1755, Primus, the Negro servant of Elihu Chesbro, and Servia, a mulatto, were married. After 1755, the Road Church recorded only 5 more marriages of minorities. All of them were for free Blacks and Native Americans. Although Venture's name never appeared in the church records of Stonington, the name of his owner's father, Thomas Stanton, showed up when a Black man named Primus, identified as living with Thomas Stanton, was baptized at the Road Church on May 9th, 1742. Interestingly, the church did not identify Primus as either a slave or a servant. Since such classification was clear in records of other Africans, this makes it fairly apparent that Primus was a free man. He was the only free Black man baptized by the church. This man, Primus, may actually have played an important role in Venture's life a few years later. After that quite notable presence of people of color in the Road Church in the 1740s, by the time Thomas Stanton II purchased Venture in 1754, Black and Native American baptisms, communions, and marriages had practically disappeared from the Stonington church records. In about 1750, the local minority population had founded a church in neighboring Westerly, Rhode Island, and it was called by the residents the Indian Church. With only the Pawcatuck River separating Stonington and Westerly, it seems that minorities from Stonington could easily have attended church services in Westerly. They maybe didn't feel as welcome anymore in Stonington. There are a few gravestones that mark the lives of Stonington Africans who might have been Christians. Near the site of Robert Stanton's farm, now in possession of the Stanton Davis Farm Museum, and just 3/4 of a mile from the farm site of Thomas Stanton II, is a small graveyard containing primarily memorials to the Stanton and Davis family members. But in that graveyard also lies Cuff Stanton. Though local lore has attributed this gravestone to Venture's son, Cuff, it's in fact the record of a different Black man named Cuff, who had been owned by the wife of Job Stanton in Stonington. The former slave was buried in the Davis graveyard in 1846 with the inscription on his stone, "We believe he was a Christian." He would have been a contemporary of Venture Smith. Stonington graveyards also includes a gravestone for Cato and Plato. There is some controversy about this stone. The stone itself, dated 1758, says the men were Indians who lived on the Minor farm, but Deacon Minor owned a mulatto slave named Cato, born in his household in 1736. Could the Cato on the gravestone be the Cato of the Minor household? Stonington Vital Records also recorded that birth date for Cato at the house of Deacon Minor. The image of Cato and Plato's gravestone is from Find a Grave, and we thank Molly Ingram of Stonington for leading us to the location of this stone. Quash is another Black man buried in Stonington at the Whitehall Cemetery in Mystic. Quash was freed by John Williams of Stonington in 1796. Identified as a member of the Groton Pequannock Baptist Church, Quash was buried in Mystic. The inscription on his grave says, "Old Quash was truly an example, and by it he being dead yet speaketh." It was erected the memorial was erected in 1867 in memory of his Christian virtues. His motto, "Walk as well as talk." Quash died in 1830. And then this one is very interesting. The grave of an enslaved woman, Minerva Stanton, is one of the few unmarked gravestones linked to a specific person of color. According to Stonington graveyards, Minerva was a slave in the Stanton household who took her name from the family who owned her. Minerva was probably Black, but she may have had some Native American ancestry, but as far as we can tell, she was not related to Venture. Peg Stewart Van Patten, a member of the Stewart family, the last private owners of the Stanton farm, provided us with a photo of Minerva's grave marked by a triangular headstone and a footstone with no inscription on either. With Peg's help, we located those markers, which are now deep in the woods. And when we found this, this site, this was really very memorable for me. We found the stones, and there was a dirt bike path going through them. So between the headstone and footstone, people were riding their dirt bikes. So that was kind of disheartening. But John Lincoln of the DEP later blocked the path over Minerva's grave. And these stones are the only concrete record we have of Minerva's existence.
Someday when the pandemic is over, we'll take walks out to Barn Island again and we'll take you to Minerva's grave. Slaves were property. The price of being property, for the most part, meant dehumanization. Meticulous examination of available probate records, including wills and inventories of estates in Stonington, provided some of the most complete evidence of the minority population in Stonington. Many documents mentioned only 1 or 2 enslaved persons, but some listed up to 10. Many wills mark the destruction of Black families, one of the most damning effects of slavery. In our examination of those 18th century probate documents, we found that wills that determined the fate of more than 90 enslaved persons treated by the probate court as property, in the same way that the court treated cows, horses, houses, and bedspreads. For most of the slaves mentioned in such wills, this was the only written record of their existence. Inventories generally listed slaves in the same sections they listed farm animals, and many times the wills, as you can see from the picture, did not even identify slaves by name, merely by age and gender. Again, in the same way they identified the cows, horses, pigs, and sheep they left to their heirs. If you look at the upper, it literally shows Negro wench, pregnant and unhealthy. And right above it, you have pigs, a sow and pigs, a boar, a large cow, a red cow, a yearling heifer. And then you have below 1 Negro wench named Zilpha. In 1753, John Hull left his slave Phyllis, daughter of his slave Chloe, to his wife Elizabeth. When Elizabeth died in 1761, her will directed that Phyllis be freed, but the executor ignored her request. Phyllis eventually sued for her freedom and damages in 1775, but lost. Settlement of a 1754 estate revealed that Pero was a slave co-owned by Thomas Noyes Jr. and John Hallam. At the death of Noyes, Hallam bought out Noyes' share of Pero. Finally, Hallam's daughter Prudence freed Pero in 1801. Now, Liz and I were here working, doing research, and an African-American woman was trying to trace Pero Hallam. She had no idea who had owned him originally because of the difficulty of tracking these people who were people but treated as property. Nehemiah Mason was a member in good standing of the Road Church who died in 1767. In his will, he had divided his 7 enslaved Negroes amongst his wife and 4 children. Rose and Deborah went to his wife Zervia. Scipio went to son Andrew. Nana became the property of Hannah, his daughter. Derek went to son Jared. And Jenny and Kate, who was identified as a Negro girl, became the possessions of Mason's daughter Zervia. All the Masons were churchgoers, but this didn't affect their willingness to own humans as property. In 1769, Elihu Chesbrough divided his 7 slaves, Negro men, Jeremiah, Prince, and Ephraim, and Negro boys, Cuffy, Nero, and Cato amongst his 3 sons. Nowhere in the will was there any consideration for the wishes of these men. Jeremiah Wheeler's 1770 estate contained the most enslaved persons of any estate we found, 10 in total. And their disposition revealed no humane consideration for those human beings. The wills divided the boys Tower Hill, Barrister and Prince, and girls Cecilia, Deliverance, Grace, Hagar, and Dinah, along with a Negro woman named Dinah, amongst Wheeler's 2 sons and 3 daughters. Since all but Dinah were identified in the will and inventory as children, it's possible these 10 people represented a family torn apart by slavery. Now, so we can finish on time, I'm skipping a little bit here, okay? I just jump forward. Freedom was hard for Black people to achieve, somewhat easier for Native Americans once they got through the slaves that had been created by the Narragansett and Pequot Wars. But the challenge of freedom was making a living on the edges of white society. Commercial records in Stonington in the 18th century reveal a sketchy picture of the economic position of minorities in the community. Until the passage of the Gradual Abolition Act in 1784, most Black people in Stonington were enslaved, and those few who were free lived a tenuous existence on the fringes of white society. Now, in his book, Lorenzo Green, has asserted that jobs were scarce for free Blacks and that their lives were marginal. Green cited a Connecticut 1717 law that specifically prohibited any free Black or free mulatto from residing in any town in the colony without permission of the town. The law also prohibited free Blacks from buying land or carrying on any business unless they had obtained prior consent of the town. Now, Green said the law was probably never enforced, but its very existence impressed on free Blacks the insecurity of their existence. It was applied once. The city of New London in 1716 was in an uproar because a slave named Jacqueline had managed to buy land. And the citizens of New London, the great God-fearing citizens of New London, petitioned the Connecticut Colonial Assembly to pass a law to ban Black people from owning land. The Assembly passed the law, also banned Native Americans from owning land, except on their reservation, and Jacqueline had to sell his property. Nevertheless, we did find records of free Black Stonington residents, besides Venture, who engaged in commerce, borrowed money, ran up debts, bought and sold property. No record that they ever got that specific approval from the town. However, the paucity of those records reveals the weak positions of Black people in a society dominated by whites. And for many of these individuals, their names on commercial records are the only evidence that they ever lived in town. Now, there's serendipity. Liz and I were here for months going through page after page of documents. A gold mine, relatively speaking, of minorities with ties to commercial activity in Stonington was in a bankruptcy petition filed by Nathaniel Miner. I've mentioned him a couple of times. Miner filed for bankruptcy in 1763 and created this cute little booklet. It's hand sewn, you can see right through the middle. And it listed all of his debts and all of his assets, including money owed to him by both whites and minorities. Interestingly, he had a separate page for the money owed by Negroes and Indians, as he called it. For most of these people, this little document is the only record of their existence. Negro York Shepherd, Negro Kike or Syke. I mean, this is very, you might even say Mike, except nobody was called Mike in 1763, okay? Negro Sip, that could have been Scipio. Negro Derek Whiting, and then the Native Americans, some with and some without last names. Nathaniel Miner was also a merchant in town. He was a justice of the peace. He functioned as an attorney, and he kept a day book, his daily record of business transactions. And that record made it clear that minorities were doing business in town. So he had fees for issuing a writ of attachment for Jonathan Ackley, a free Negro, 1778. 1785, he had fees due for writing a bill of sale to a Negro boy, to John Dennison. He had fees due from Negro Hagar for a hog lost last fall. He had multiple fees due from Jonathan Waldron, a debtor who was being sued by Mingo Mackey, a Negro. And due from Sambo Mason, a free Negro. It was Miner's fee in a case versus Joseph Latham. Now, slaves also sometimes appeared in commercial transactions, not because they could borrow money or lend money, but because they were delivering or collecting goods or mentioned in bills of sale. One of the most notable in the sea town of Stonington was that Ben Adam Gallup noted in May of 1785 that my Negro Caesar, we think that's how it is, hard to read it, discharged from the brig Betsy, Captain Joseph Conklin, master. Now, Gallup had probably collected whatever wages were due his slave. The next entry was the most discouraging, perhaps the saddest that we found. It was found in a commercial day book. These were books that merchants and other businessmen kept, the debits and credits that people owed them. A typical day book, each entry would have credits and debits. Credits, what the person brought into the store, to barter for what they were taking from the store. John Palmer of Stonington kept a day book to record transactions with his customers, creditors and debtors. And in his day book, what appears to be an index on page 8 for the year 1784 has the simple entry Mint Negro. That the name is in the day book indicates Mint was a free person of color. There is nothing, not age, gender, former owner, or anything else to help identify this person, yet he or she was a member of the minority community in Stonington. Justice of the Peace records maintained by Nathaniel Miner between 1770 and 1785 identified 20 more Black and Native American individuals in town charged with theft or assault, sued or suing for debts, or being called as witnesses. What we found absolutely amazing was that 4 different times, Venture, who was not using the name Smith until after he moved to East Haddam in 1775, sued his last white owner, Oliver Smith. For other litigants, it was often the only time, okay, that their names appeared in the record. But Venture was here suing. Now, Venture in his narrative said he never spent any money for anything, never borrowed money, yet this entry is, Venture is being listed as a debtor on the estate of, I don't think I wrote it down, but Scipio also, down a little bit farther, I apologize, I took that picture.
We took these pictures a long time ago and we said, we'll go back and get better ones. And then we had a pandemic. So that made it impossible. So Scipio is there on the edge.
So you can see the PIO, but identified as a Negro. Venture appeared as a creditor, claiming money from a white man, Job Irish, also in Miner's records. Roger, a free Negro, sued in 1772 to collect on a book debt. So he had his own book, his own day book, but he lost his case. Breach of peace and assault were amongst the most common charges, with theft a close third. And again, I love bringing in the maritime tradition of this community, because in 1762, Nathaniel Pendleton and Sylvester Cotterill of Stonington brought a charge of theft against 7 men for stealing their small schooner, the Flying Fish. 6 of the men were from Stonington. 5 identified as white, but George Crosby identified as Indian. And also Harry Will, identified as a mustee of Westerly. Buying land is one of the best ways for people to get ahead. That's true in 2021 as it was back in the 18th century. A few free Black people and Native Americans also bought land in Stonington. As I mentioned before, there is notably no record of anyone specifically requesting the selectmen of the town to approve them for buying land. But other than Venture's purchase of 26 acres in 1770, there was not another purchase of a substantial amount of land. What Liz is showing you, okay, is the deed of purchase, which says received for consideration of 60 pounds lawful money received to our satisfaction from Venture, a free Negro man of said Stonington. Jonathan Dennison IV and his wife, Eunice Stanton Dennison, all those Stantons and Dennisons in there, sold Venture land in Wickety in what is now part of Long Island. There was not another purchase of that amount, which meant that Blacks, even when they owned land, still lived a marginalized existence. I'll look up, let me see here. I think the Ventures.
This is Venture's sale.
Sale, okay. So Venture sold that land 4 years later. The land abutted the land of his former owner. When I've taken people out to the property, there's a place on what was Venture's land where he could stand and see the household of his former owner. And he wrote in his narrative that he could motion to his wife, Meg, and meet her, basically in secret. And Meg was pregnant when Venture purchased her freedom in 1775. And in his narrative, he even said, so I saved myself some money. But most free Blacks continued to live that marginalized existence. Now, the first land sale we found wasn't until 1759 in Stonington. Eliphalet Stewart sold 6 acres of land at a place called Jassup's. Any of you know where that is? I'd love to know. I found out a lot of other local, site names, but Jassup's meant nothing to me. By a warranty deed to Samuel Apes. The price was for 6 pounds. Now, interestingly, almost every deed we found, buying or selling by Native Americans or Blacks, indicated race. This particular first deed we found did not identify Samuel Apes as a Native American, but other references to Samuel Apes in town in commercial and church records do call him an Indian. Now, 4 years later, Apes sold that exact same 6 acres back to Stewart for only 4 pounds, but he signed with an X. Now, Liz has got the sale deed. The next 2 deeds we found, we've already seen the picture of Venture's purchase, but the same day, December 3rd, 1770, that Venture purchased 26 acres, Primus Babcock, a free Negro man, bought 6 acres from William Slack. The property description makes it pretty clear that the southernmost tip of Primus's 6 acres was the northernmost tip of Venture's acres. Now, Venture's sale shows an X. And being a venturista, being someone on the trail of finding Venture, means you hear a lot of nonsense. And in doing this research, in one of the genealogies, somebody who looked at this same deed said, Venture's strong mark X that he made on the deed. This isn't the original deed. This is the copy in the land records. We have no idea what Venture's real X looked like, but he sold that property. All right? Primus continued to own his land, okay, until his death. In the 1790s, his children, who had actually taken the name Primus as their surname, sold the land, but in the deed, it expressly says it's the same land that our father Primus bought. That's a problem we had in searching, because minority people often change names. Was the Primus who was baptized in 1742, the Primus Psyche, was the Primus Babcock, was the Primus Honored Father, was that the same person? We don't know. The remaining transactions of land show small amounts of land. Ephraim Smith was the son of Sharp Smith's owner. Sharp Smith purchased land and then sold it. Sorry, he purchased land and then Ephraim sold him additional land, but the total land, okay, was 142 rods plus 4 acres. People made a living being farmers. You cannot be a farmer with 42 acres and 142 rods. So people lived on the margins.
Some slaves took their freedom by running away. 25-year-old Caesar ran away from Robert Stanton in 1760. It's not clear if this Robert Stanton was the older brother of Thomas Stanton II, Venture's owner. Another Caesar, aged 23, ran away from Elisha Williams in 1796. Bet, identified as a mulatto, ran away from owner Nathan Palmer in 1784. And Cuff, aged 23, claimed as a slave by Peter Crary, ran away in 1790. Crary was still advertising for his return in the Connecticut Gazette in 1794. 4 years later, he still wanted him back. 16-year-old Catherine Boland ran away from Ichabod Eccleston in 1792. She was born too early to benefit from the gradual abolition law passed in 1784. Also in 1792, Mingo escaped from Robert Chesbrough, and probate records revealed that a Negro boy who had been appraised at a value of 40 pounds in the 1792 inventory of Captain Joseph Holmes had run away since Holmes's death. And the court just reduced the estate value by that 40 pounds. They didn't bother advertising for the runaway. Volunteering for the military service was another pathway to freedom. Though colonial laws had specifically exempted Blacks and Indians from the required militia training, the need for manpower in the American Revolution opened up a chance for freedom to Stonington's enslaved persons. Jacob Green served as a volunteer in the state's 6th Regiment during the American Revolution. He died in the Army in 1776 before gaining his freedom as a reward for serving. Ebenezer Hill, born in 1740, fought in the Battle of Saratoga and gained his freedom in 1777. He even collected a pension after the war. Cujo, enslaved by Oliver Holmes, enlisted in the Army in 1781 in return for the promise of his freedom. After the war, Holmes tried to reclaim Cujo as a slave, but Cujo successfully sued for his freedom, winning his case and his freedom in 1784. Some of the most revealing documents we uncovered were emancipation documents, those that granted freedom to enslaved persons. These documents were especially difficult to find because in some cases, they were dispersed in volumes of land records, as well as records of the selectmen of the town, tax records, and probate records. I have to say it was shocking to me to find these emancipations in the land records. So you'd be reading about who sold what lot to whom, and then you'd find an emancipation stuck in there. It was just disorienting. Furthermore, in the land records, the card file of grantees and grantors was at times missing cards for emancipations, whether that was the result of an intentional act in the past, that scrubbing Nancy mentioned, or mere careless refiling. We had the sense of a needle in the haystack search. One day, Nancy found a card referencing an emancipation that had been placed out of alphabetical order. It was upside down, it was backwards, under a different letter in the card file. And this was for an emancipation. Finding that card was pure serendipity. Making it even more challenging was that at least one volume of land records had been recopied, omitting, it left out, the declarations of emancipation. Nancy and I literally examined both copies. We sat at a table and across from each other and went through page by page. And we were stunned to find a record of Oliver Smith's 1772 emancipation of his slave Prince, which is what you see here. The original version of volume 3 of the town's vital statistics, but not in the copy that was made later. We searched in vain for a document of Venture's emancipation in 1764, but we're fairly sure that it followed the format of Prince's emancipation that we see here. Venture had complained that Oliver Smith charged him the enormous sum of 71 pounds, 4 shillings for his freedom. Interestingly, when Smith freed Prince in 1772, so 8 years later, he charged him only 30 pounds for his freedom. Emancipations followed several models depending on the date. Prior to 1784, there were few in the town records, and similar to that for Prince, they declared that the enslaved person was to be freed at a certain date. Emancipations in wills had somewhat more detail, and at times showed that slaves were valued as individuals by their enslavers. In 1771, David Lamb's will said, "I give and bequeath to my Negro woman Betty her freedom in 6 months after my decease, and my will is that she shall be free and at her own disposal and be no longer a slave." He also left her household goods and clothing. Lamb went further. His will gave freedom to his 2 adult Blacks and 2 boys, granting Prince, Pharaoh, Shadrach, age 15, and Caesar, age 10, their freedom when each reached age 25. Lamb left 5 pounds lawful money to the adults and 40 shillings each to the boys. He further directed his executors that the boys should be taught a trade, the trade of tanner and shoemaker. Yet few testators took such care of their slaves. Ephraim Smith's 1774 will gave his slave Sharp to his wife, but added, when dismissed by her, the said Negro man is to be maintained and supported by the several heirs to my estate during his life. Apparently still a slave, but not required to work. As the land records showed, Sharp eventually did achieve tenuous freedom through land ownership, but he certainly could not have thrived with so little land. In 1774, the will of Sarah Morgan gave unto my Negro woman Jenny her freedom at my decease and her bed and wearing apparel. A separate will by Sarah Morgan in 1778 granted freedom to her slave Pero, along with his bed, bedstead, and cord, and 2 coverlets, which he has commonly used. She further directed her executor to put her mulatto boy Jack into an apprenticeship to learn tanning and shoemaking, the apprenticeship to last until he reached age 23. This will then set Jack free at age 23, giving him 10 pounds along with his bed and bedding. The inventory of Mrs. Morgan's estate set a value of 20 pounds for young Jack, but assigned no value to Pero. Nevertheless, these wills recognizing the humanity of slaves were few and far between. As we've discussed, most wills and inventories treated slaves as personal property and had no concern for the personal fate of those they disposed of.
Chelsea's told me we're running out of time, but I'm still going to get through this. Okay?
We're almost done.
Almost done. Okay. Except I've got to flip my pages.
33.
33. Okay. Thank you. I mentioned the gradual abolition law. Gradual abolition was Connecticut's way of ending slavery. Massachusetts ended slavery by a constitutional amendment. New Hampshire never had slavery. Vermont was a separate republic until it became the 14th state in the 1790s. Rhode Island and Connecticut issued this gradual abolition. Nobody paid the slave owners to free these children, but they got the labor of the children until they reached age 25 to compensate them for raising the children. The law required that the slave owner obtain permission from the selectmen of a town before freeing a slave. The owner had to provide a bond to ensure the slave never became a subject of the town as a financial burden. The law required that the enslaved person say he or she wanted freedom. And the language of the application for freedom specifically described the slave, stating age, general health, along with ability to support oneself. We discovered over 24 declarations, all of which were after 1785, aside from the one Liz showed you of Prince, most of them listing just a first name. The average age was 34, oldest person was 42, the youngest was 26, not counting young George, 1-year-old, who was the son of 31-year-old, his mom, Kate, who was seeking freedom. James and Rose said, the selectmen said they want to be made free, they're of good health, not of extreme age, over age 45, nor less than 25 years. Other emancipation documents used a slightly different phrase, that the slaves were industrious, in good health, and able to support life. Not one of these 24 documents made any provision to help the slave once the slave was in freedom. For Stonington's minorities, freedom did not mean successful integration into the dominant white society. It meant a hard, grinding struggle to make a life for themselves and their families. Of all the minority residents we uncovered in Stonington, only Venture was what you could call successful. The writer of Venture's narrative saw this in 1798, with that quote I read to you at the beginning. With opportunity, all Blacks and Native Americans had the potential to be Ventures. But would white society provide that opportunity? So here's our conclusion. Because Venture Smith's narrative was published in New London in 1798, his life and adventures have endured, and he has not been forgotten. 2 centuries after he lived, historians continue to study his narrative and search for evidence of Venture's life, while everyone from school children, like here in Stonington, and adults continue to be inspired by his story. But Venture is the exception. The vast majority of people of color who lived and worked in Stonington and elsewhere before, during, and after Venture's life, whether they were enslaved or free, their stories have been largely forgotten by history. As we've demonstrated, for many, the record of their existence as part of this community is sparse at best. For most, evidence of their lives is non-existent. Our search for evidence of Venture Smith's life in Stonington helped us to better understand Venture himself. And it also provided us with a keener appreciation for the scope of Stonington's founding family's involvement in the institution of slavery. But perhaps most significantly, our research has revealed a hidden history of the town's minority population. We hope this work will help us all to remember them as we go forward. And as I said, witness stones, we may be able to broaden that record. Thank you. So, Chelsea?
Yes,
We're running out of time, but we do have time for some questions.
absolutely. So can you both hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. I'm going to read a few of the questions that we had in the chat. For anyone who's interested in staying for the Q&A, please feel free. Just do not unmute yourselves. If you have questions, just put them in the chat for us. And that way I'll be able to relay them to our presenters. Thank you. So I know we had a few early on. Pardon me, I'm just going to find them here. All right, so one of them was, you mentioned that in the 18th century, they used the term servant to refer to enslaved people. Did they also use the term servant to refer to indentured servants?
Yes, they did.
Is there a large disparity in time for that or no?
No, pretty much an indentured servant was an indentured servant. The anomaly is that Blacks were not indentured, but they used the term servant. We really didn't start using the term slave until we saw the probate documents and the emancipation documents.
Okay. Gail McDonald, who some of you may know, she is the author of Hidden History of Stonington and Mystic. She was asking, did the descendants of any of the 18th century enslaved people stay in Stonington and later become part of the Black community in the village in the 19th century, many of whom worked for steamship lines or the railroad?
Chelsea, we did not go beyond 1800.
Okay.
We have the census of 1890, which has those 5 heads of household, but they did not have surnames. It was Pero and Quash.
It says Negro Will.
Negro Will.
Cuff.
Negro Cuff. So it would, we're going to continue to try to work on this project and identify, but it's hard to know.
Excellent. Thank you. So Nancy Roy would like to know, how did Venture end up being buried in East Haddam?
Oh, well, you need to go to the University of North Carolina website, read Venture's narrative. He relocated to East Haddam in 1775 after selling his land in Stonington. He ended up owning about 110 acres. He was a successful landowner. He was a respected businessman, although he was not literate. And he was held in such great respect that at his burial, they buried him in the white section of the East Haddam Congregational Church, which is where this stone is located. Typically, when we were looking up Blacks in the cemeteries, for the most of them, like Western Its Witnesses literally says, many of the Indian burial grounds maybe also include Negroes and Africans. But typically their stones had no engraving or lettering on them.
Okay. Let's see. We had another question about a source question. So where can you find the records on the population numbers in Connecticut towns that you had mentioned, the 1750s ones, where they break down?
That's in the colonial records of Connecticut. It is online, available through the state library website. And genealogists love them because it lists, everyone who was a lieutenant or a colonel or a, private in the militia. But very rarely do they mention Blacks. But those censuses, the 1754 and 1775, are in the 1774 volume, which I think is volume 14. So it has a summary of the 1754 and then all of the details for the 1774. The Stonington census we found in the Stonington Town Annals, handwritten. Liz created a PowerPoint slide, but that was in the Stonington Town Hall. I want to thank Cindy Ledwig, by the way. She was so wonderful letting us just live there for years, it seemed.
That's excellent. All right, there's a lot of interest for the Witness Stones project. Someone has passed along his contact information if you'd like to be in touch with him about that.
I very much would like that. This is an incredible project, and it's going to take a lot of people going through. I mean, we showed you the stone of Cuff Stanton in the Stanton Davis Cemetery off Greenhaven Road by Osbrook Point. Most of the stones in that cemetery are illegible because these old cemeteries are not maintained. So finding stones of Africans will require people literally saying, I will do X cemetery, and going through and almost hand tracing the letters of these lichen covered stones to see who's there. Again, we're going to keep working on it, but the more people who want to get involved, these people matter. I mean, I'll share with you all. I used to say, yeah, my family came into Massachusetts in the 1630s. They went right to Vermont. They never owned slaves. Okay, I have discovered through this project, I'm descended from Joshua Hempstead, who owned slaves. Nathaniel Hempstead was a great uncle. Nathaniel Hempstead Minor. Nathaniel Minor was a great Hempstead Minor, who abused Venture, was an uncle. I'm related to the Chesboroughs, the Podhursts, the Miners. They all own slaves. Who I am, if you look at the incremental value of past lives, is based on slave labor.
Interesting. We've had an interesting counterpoint question here. We've talked a lot about enslavement this evening. Did you find any evidence of an abolitionist movement in Stonington?
No, Chelsea, but we do have, again, if I had 5 hours, I would have done it. John Dennison IV and Eunice sold Venture land.
Yes.
That was an outright affront to most of white society. When Oliver Smith freed Venture, literally was only the second emancipation we found. Somebody in Stonington, of those founding families, finally decided slavery was wrong. But no formal abolition group.
Interesting. So I don't know if everyone watching this evening knows this, but the research that Liz and Nancy have done for us is part of a grant project, the outcome of which is a permanent exhibit in the first floor of the Lighthouse Museum about Venture Smith and about slavery in Stonington and in the North. So this is going to be kind of our source material to build that exhibit. So hopefully that's scheduled to, we're hoping to have a celebratory opening Juneteenth weekend, which would be really fitting, I think. So let's see, there's a couple other just quick questions that we can answer. So Venture's land in Stonington is on Barn Island. I've had a number of people ask me exactly where it is. But from what I've seen, it's quite in the middle of the woods.
Yep, Chelsea, if they use Google Earth, okay, a winter picture. It is off Stewart Road, right where Stewart Road runs into Brookham and Pentway. There's what looks like a dirt driveway. It heads north. You follow that dirt road a quarter of a mile, you come to a parking lot. That parking lot was bulldozed over the foundation of Thomas Stanton II's house. If you can locate that parking lot on Google Earth in the winter, then you look almost directly to the north and you will see a huge glacial erratic, which was on Venture's property. It's not a cornerstone, but it's where Venture supposedly stood and motioned to Meg to come on over.
I have a couple of pictures. Do you want me to find them? Let me just skip through here. I had some things we weren't sure we would need. Not that one. So there's the erratic.
That's the erratic.
Oh,
That's the Stewart farm in 1931 with no trees. That's the Stewart farm in 1965. The trees have grown up.
Now it's in the middle of the woods.
Now it's in the middle of the
There's trees
woods.
all around. There's trees growing out of it.
But it is accessible by pathways from the parking lot off Stewart Road. It's about a 10-15 minute walk. Liz and I take the Stonington Local History School kids from the high school there when there's not a pandemic, a couple times a year.
all right. I'm going to use our last question, and this is an interesting one. There's just a little bit of confusion about how you knew that those stones in the woods were Minerva Stanton's.
Okay. Peg Stewart Van Patten is a granddaughter of one of the last owners of the property. When she was a child, the Thomas Stanton second house was her grandparents' house. They would walk from the house to Venture's Rock, the big glacial erratic, and they also would walk to Minerva's grave, which is on the far eastern side of that section of Barn Island. It's a stone wall, there's private property on the other side. And in 2005, Peg helped us find the rock, Peg helped us find the gravestones. And here in the Stonington Historical Society, in the same group of pictures as that big rock is a picture of this girl. I think she's about 10. She's actually Chief Stewart's sister, sitting, pointing at Minerva's gravestones.
Wow. Well, that's fantastic. I want to thank Nancy and Liz again so much for this presentation. The chat is full of people just thanking you for your attention to detail and for taking on this work and for sharing it with the community in such a approachable way. I would just like to make a quick statement. For anyone who is a member of the Historical Society, you get our quarterly newsletter. The February newsletter this year is dedicated to the research that Liz and Nancy have done. It's a pretty good chunk of overview of the project. It takes up almost the whole magazine, but there were things included in that article that were not included in the talk tonight, and vice versa. I would also like to say that we have recorded this lecture. We're going to try and share it with our community for anyone who missed it or had to leave early this evening. So I just want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. If you would like to check the chat very quickly, there are some really good resources that some of our viewers had shared with each other about things you might want to read, websites to check out. So I would just encourage everyone to take a quick look through the chat before you sign off this evening. But thank you all so much for joining us.
Chelsea, one other thing.
Yes, please.
There is a printed copy available at the London County Historical Society Adventures Narrative. It's about 40 pages, it's $5. But the University of North Carolina has the entire narrative available online. If you don't mind reading online, I suggest anyone read the narrative. It is the most amazing, it is the most thorough narrative, slave narrative. And some people who have looked at it have believed that Alex Haley actually used the first part of the narrative, Venture's recollection of being in Africa, for the first part of Roots. And when you read it, you'll see some similarities. So thank you. Listen, I love to talk about this. When the pandemic is gone, we'll schedule a walk out to the Rock again.
Take you for a walk.
Absolutely. Would love
Thank you
that.
very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great evening. Happy Valentine's Day if that's on your radar. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.